Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this Central St. Martin's Innovation Season. My name is David Toop. I'm Emeritus Professor at London College of Communication. Before I retired, I was Professor of Audio Culture and Improvisation, and I'm really happy to welcome Lawrence English, who is currently in Brisbane, Australia, where it's late at night, late evening. So, welcome, Lawrence. Great to
My pleasure to be here.
see you.
Thank you for having me. You too.
I'm not going to read out a bio for Lawrence because I think it's always a bit awkward when people do that. And besides, Lawrence and I have a long relationship as friends and collaborators. We've known each other for many years, and Lawrence has got me to Australia on a number of occasions where we've worked together in various ways. But what I should say about Lawrence is that he is an extraordinary field recordist. And that's mainly what we're going to focus on here today. But he's also a musician, a composer. He is a theorist, I guess you could say. He's a recording engineer. He's an organizer, a tireless organizer. He's organized many, many events in Australia, and he runs a fantastic record label called Room 40. So there's a lot of things going on with Lawrence, but today we're going to focus on field recording and listening to sound. And I think maybe one of the best starting points would be to talk about, first of all, technology. So technology has been used in the 20th century to give us access to many of those aspects of the world that were otherwise hidden from us. And I think, Lawrence, it would be interesting if you could start off by talking about that. The types of technology that have revealed these hidden sounds. Maybe you could run through some of the different devices and the way in which they've changed our perception of the world. And I guess the way in which they've emphasized to us that human perception is extremely limited, that what we perceive as reality is circumscribed by what we can perceive.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, before I start, I want to acknowledge just today that I'm here on Yugara and Turrbal land. That's the Indigenous owners on unceded land here in Brisbane. It is a really interesting question because technology has been the facilitation device for how it is that we've sort of opened up our potential understandings of the world. I think the thing that is really interesting for me about this question of technology is that inbuilt within it is this idea of a sort of aspiration to be reaching out or pushing out or expanding, or maybe in some respects also reducing the signals that we can come in contact with. And, you know, I think when you start to look at what's happened, particularly, I guess, in the last 40 years, when there have been like significant technological developments, even something as simple as the interface for something. I've been listening to a lot of shortwave radio, for example, and for some reason I got quite obsessed with shortwave radio during the pandemic. I guess because it was a way to still pretend that there was a world out there bigger than in here. And what was interesting about it was within a few minutes of starting to look at it, I have a shortwave receiver here, and I built a small antenna, or made a lot antenna outside of the house that runs up onto our roof and uses the metal of the roof as a bit of a kind of amplification device. And that gives you a very particular impression, but there is a fantastic online device that's, I think, at the University of Utrecht, which is a kind of shortwave. It basically records all shortwave activity, and in a kind of like a waterfall, this waterfall of data kind of going up the screen, and then allows you to tune in to certain kinds of frequencies, reduce right down to just pick up, might be like some domestic radio in China or amateur bands or whatever the case might be. And I think that kind of exposure, that you can have this opportunity to experience everything through this device, but to be able to close that down to reveal something in it is really telling about, I think, the way the technology operates, but with sound especially, because it is about giving us a way to navigate. It's a kind of tool for navigation. And that navigation might be something that is about a kind of macro perspective, or it might be about a micro perspective. So I think particularly when we start thinking about the potential waves and frequencies that exist outside of our hearing range. I mean, we have such a small window, effectively 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. I don't believe my hearing is that good anymore, but that top band is really wound back a little bit over the decades. But you realize how small that window is, and you have all this information that sits below us in that kind of infrasonic range, and then above us in the ultrasonic range, and then you keep going up from there. There's something to be said, I think, for those devices, like, for example, this one here, which open up other possibilities, other places, other spectra through which we can kind of engage with this. So this is just a very simple electromagnetic receiver, which is built by a company in Slovakia, LOM, who make amazing, they also make a fantastic geophone. And basically what it does is it picks up electromagnetic radiation and makes it audible to us. It has a small device that transforms those signals, which they travel without a medium. And this sound is going on all around us all of the time. If you've ever had the pleasure of using something like this, which is a VLF receiver, it's like picks up information, electromagnetic disturbances, basically in the ionosphere. If you ever turn that on and you're not more than sort of 3 or 4 kilometers away from the nearest power pole, all you hear is this enormous hum. And that hum, occasionally you hear it on the street if you walk past a power box. But most of the time that is just going on, and we're deaf to it. Most of the world, I think, we're deaf to. But this device, if I just turn it around.
So you can't hear that, but we can. It seems to have completely cut out your sound, Lawrence. No, you're mute.
Okay. Have I distorted myself?
Yeah, you cancelled yourself. That's interesting.
But I'm back now.
Was that the device itself that cancelled you?
I think maybe it was the overloading of Zoom that cancelled me. I'd reached maximum output. I could see the, maybe I'll try and turn it down quite a bit. And I'll try again, 1 second. Is that better?
Yeah.
It's not quite immersed back on anymore, but it's good while it lasted. But I mean, it's an extraordinary device because it reveals all of this information that is directly in front of me right now, coming out of it is being emitted by the laptop, but we're completely unable to have any relation with it without the technology. And I think that, very simple reveal is absolutely compelling as to why that relationship between a practice like field recording or acoustic ecology or anything, I mean, music making, communication, all of those things are completely, our capacities are completely shaped by the technologies we develop.
Yeah, I think to plunge us straight into shortwave radio is interesting because that's not the first thing a lot of people would think about if they're thinking field recording. So that begs the question, what is field recording? And that's something that you and I have talked about together a lot. And in fact, you released an edition of mine which was specifically designed to ask this question about field recording, what it is. So I'm interested to hear what you think about that. I mean, in a way, everything you've talked about is plunging us into these strange, inaccessible areas, you know, and I guess a lot of people might think field recording, oh yeah, it's going to be a recording of a bridge or a bird or something like that. But already you've taken us into the ionosphere. And the other question, you raised this point about acoustic ecology, and I think we should also examine that term, ecology, and what that means. But let's talk about field recording first. And what are your thoughts on field recording? What actually is it to you?
I think a good way to answer is what is it to me? That's for sure. Because I think if you start talking about it in broader terms, it becomes a lot more complicated. I mean, I think it's interesting to understand it.
Sorry to interrupt, but
Mm.
I mean, field recording, as I understand it, comes from sociology,
Yes.
and anthropology. So you go out into the field and you meet people or you live with people and you document findings based on interviews with them. So that's in a sense one of the source areas where this contemporary notion of field recording comes from. And it's obviously true to certain kinds of field recording, like, for example, if you're recording frogs or birds. But it's very, very different to the kind of devices you've just demonstrated. So, yeah, sorry for that interruption, but I just wanted to establish some of the history of that term. But what does it mean to you?
Well, no, actually, I think that history is actually a really good thing to talk about, because we do have these terms that in some way guide, that they become principal reference points for how we understand something. And if you look at something like field recording, that early period of field recording, it's extraordinary because there was this, going back to that idea of aspiration, there was almost like it was much more emphatic. There was almost like a belief that somehow these recordings were the thing that they were being, they were recording of. So you had this idea of sound photographs, because at that point photography was also seen as this way of almost like objective documentation. And this is, okay, we're talking about 100 years ago, but that period when those sound recordings started to be possible, a little bit after that, people talked about them as sound photographs. I think that one of the Lomax brothers talked about them as sound photographs, that somehow they were able to capture the actuality of that thing, that they were there, which of course completely negated the technology. Because the technology was one of the great kind of points of tension and failure, I think, in those early recordings. I mean, at the time, maybe tension and failure. Now we see it with a kind of aesthetic lens almost, and some of those techniques become a production guideline for how it is that you make something feel old or aged or textured. But those very early recordings that were made, often they captured more of the recording device than the recording itself. For people to actually cut through the noise level in the machine required such a dynamic performance. Like those early operatic recordings, and got some incredible recordings made in Australia of some indigenous singers from Tasmania. And they're quite, the range and the power that's needed of the voice to kind of cut through is really something. So it's interesting that we started from, like you say, this sort of anthropology and ethnography, these ideas that they were objective recordings. And it's not really until, I guess, the late 60s almost, like I always use Luc Ferrari's Pesqueria as the kind of turning point for this idea that it's not necessarily an objective practice, that it's a subjective practice, that in fact you are guiding a kind of pathway through these sounds through the prosthetic ear of the microphone, in a way. So I think what's interesting is the period between that occurring, where people recognize, well, actually, if I walk around the village, I can make a kind of sound walk, or however you want to describe it, field recording. Then somehow, I guess, probably I would say around the time that you curated Sonic Boom, there was this shift where somehow field recording had become part of the sound art canon. It just kind of arrived as this thing that was like, it's a legitimate practice, legitimate artistic practice. And I found it kind of interesting to think about, well, how did it get there? And if field recording is to be considered part of the sound art canon, then where's the creativity of that process? Because I mean, field recording in some respects can be technical craft. There's a kind of technique that is there, and that's certainly part of it. And there can be artistry in that craft. But part of my research a few years ago was to kind of unpack that a little bit. And my suggestion was, a provocation was, that in fact it's the listening that becomes where the creativity begins. Maybe not ends, but like begins. That idea of of all of the possible listenings, that you are selecting one, and you are trying to, there's the great Peter Shendy quotes from the book Listen. He says, can one make a listening listen to? And if you can you transmit that listening as unique as it is? And they were the two kind of provocations for my PhD, essentially. And I still think they're incredible provocations now, because they capture all the things, this idea of, can one make a listening, that it's not a universal, it's not listening, it's singular, it's this trajectory in time and place. And this idea of transmission, which is where the technological part ties into itself. So, I mean, for me to come back to that question of field recording, I mean, I would like to think that field recording is that opportunity to share audition, to share those moments. And it's not going to be the same moment, obviously, but what it does is set up an opportunity where, for those moments where I think there is that successful transmission of, I called it the listeners listening, when that takes place, it's like you are getting this privileged moment of understanding or appreciating, coming to the world through someone else's ears, which is an extraordinary gift, I think, because it reveals a lot about your own way of being in the world. And I think, actually, going back to those early technological revolutions, the introduction of Edison's early recording devices, part of the challenge was, they would be there making that recording, and they'd listen to it as it's being done with their ears. This is incredible. And then they would play back this recording. It was this rattly, rusty, kind of like, horrific sort of rendition. And then I imagine it must have been such, I mean, partly there would have been wonder that, wow, we can do that. But once that kind of wore down, you'd be like, wow, the quality's a bit rough,
Well, it's interesting you say that. Actually, I should interrupt just what we're saying. Something I should have said right at the beginning. If any of you listening and watching have questions, just please put them in the chat, and we will come to your questions later on. But yeah, this question of what they heard is very, very interesting. Because if we listen to it now, there's something quite spectral about those recordings, something very ghostly. And of course, there are all kinds of connections at that time with spiritualism. Many of those people were involved in spiritualism. And there was a feeling that the new technology could contact the dead and so on. So it's interesting to think about the subjectivity of hearing those recordings at that time, and whether there was an acceptance of this high noise factor or a non-hearing of it. It's with every stage of technology, we become adjusted to the new, don't we? And Absolutely. It sounds kind of normal. It sounds neutral, normal. And then 10, 15 years later, we're listening back to that, and it has a character. It has a personality. And we can hear it. So always we're hearing new developments as a kind of perfection. but with
Yeah,
time they become clear to us. And I think in some ways there's a parallel with that to this thing we talked about at the beginning, which is the revealing of inaccessible sounds. I mean, there's a great, you probably know this story, but Katie Payne did research on elephant sounds. And there's a great story she tells of while recording elephants at a zoo, there were times when she and her fellow researchers just felt pressure. There was something going on. They couldn't hear anything, but they just felt this kind of intense pressure. And they were wondering, what is this? And they took it to somebody at Cornell who had built his own device, which gave a visual representation of sound, a sonograph. And in these moments, which they'd recorded on a timeline, when they felt this pressure, they could see all of these marks on the sonograph. So by recording using slow speeds and then speeding them up, they realized that elephants were communicating with infrasound, so sound below the level of human hearing. And that was the pressure they were feeling. That was this kind of force that they were sensing, but they couldn't actually hear. And once that's revealed, the world of elephants opens up in the most remarkable way. And so, these inaccessible sounds, it's not just a question of satisfying our curiosity by suddenly being able to hear them, suddenly being able to hear bats or whatever it is, or infrasonic machine noise, come to that. It's really about leading us to a greater understanding of what's going on with different communities, I guess you could say, or different I don't know,
strata
assemblages of phenomena that we don't really understand because it's just not accessible to us.
It's extraordinary when you start thinking in those terms because you recognize how much we've missed, I think. And that's in some respects maybe one of the joys of a practice like field recording is that you are trying to be conscious of the things that might be missed. And that's part of the I guess the curiosity that drives people to have that as part of their practice. And I think actually in a very direct way, that also links into this kind of practice of listening. I think that there's a very strong link there, and having to be curiosity is a huge driver towards that. And I think it also provides an affirmation as well when you have those moments where you do encounter something that is, I'm sure they must have been very excited when they recognized that there was this whole other thing going on directly in front of them. Like they could potentially even visually see the gestures because the throat of the I'm sure the throat of the elephants would have been vibrating like an crocodile does. Those incredible low frequency. I mean, visually in the water, the crocodile gives it away a little bit more readily, but which I think is also an interesting point, thinking about the way that mediums allow us to perceive certain things like atmosphere or whatever the case might be. But yeah, it is interesting because I think as well, the other thing to come back to ourselves as a species, we're probably one of the very few species that I would say output more acoustic detritus, let's say, than we need to. I mean, most of our capacity to communicate, if we were to have just 300 hertz to 3000 hertz, which is actually what they used to have as a hard filter on dial phones, like dial tone phones. There was a hard filter because they worked out that to understand communication effectively and to reduce noise over long distances, that was the information that we needed to be able to understand each other. 300 hertz to 3 kilohertz. But, we are so good at outputting sound materials as a species, whether it's cars, boats in the ocean, the computer with electromagnetic noise pouring out of it. I mean, everything that we do is about this kind of process of amplification and excess, in a way, excess to the needs of communication. And I think partly what the technology does for us is it maybe helps us recognize that in some instances, in very practical ways, like obviously the elephants is slightly to the side of this, but in North Queensland and also in Holland, there have been joint studies done that have looked at bird calls, like particularly male bird calls during breeding season, of communities of birds that are nearby highways. And what they've recognized over the past 15 years as the kind of ambient noise floor of traffic has increased is that birds are either outputting more volume to be heard over the top, or in some cases, particularly here in Queensland, they've actually pitched their voices up to sit in a register slightly above the kind of ambient noise of the highway. And they are the male birds that are more successful at breeding than the other birds. So there's like an actual biological toll that's paid by these poor birds that can't, sing up an octave. Um, it's a pretty brutal game out there for the syrinx, let me tell you. But it's fascinating because it does show that there is this direct kind of linkage there. And we would only be able to really properly understand that, because I imagine the pitch difference probably isn't that audible, but to be able to go and look at a sonogram, suddenly you can see over time, durationally, that there is a way to comprehend that shift year to year almost.
Let's talk about this idea of ecology and what it means now. I first became aware of the term in the early 1970s, when ecology was a real talking point. It suddenly became a popular area of study, and people started to understand this idea that everything is interlinked. But what do you feel that it means now, particularly in relation to thinking about sound and listening?
I think it's interesting. I mean, I would say it's still very much obviously in people's minds, probably, if not more than before, maybe, because it's a term that is so readily available. It's not just within certain communities now. Everyone, I think, has an appreciation for this idea of ecology. I think what's interesting about the use of sound and technology and in ecological studies is, in the last decade, particularly as technology has permitted this to take place, longitudinal survey and longitudinal study is possible in a way that wasn't before. And that's partly to do with development of solar cell batteries and the ability for people to set up recording possibilities that are ongoing for many months and then be able to process that in a quantitative way, to look for whether it's doing something as simple as like species density studies, or in some cases looking for species that maybe maybe in an area that they've seen through other evidence, and sound is one of the ways that can be also quantified. I think that's been a huge shift in the way that we understand ecology as or sound and its relationship to ecology as one of the like key data sources going forward. But I think, and this is more, I suppose, a almost philosophical way to think about it, I think the relationship, the root idea of ecology as this sort of like mesh or net, that's constantly in flux and dynamic and changing and shifting, and maybe things return at certain points. For me, there is a real linkage there with this idea of sound, this idea of a horizon of audition, or whatever you want to call it, this vista. They share the same kinds of properties, that the environment, we can appreciate it over time. We can see those shifts like seasonality in the same way that we appreciate sound, maybe at a slightly different time scale. But, the simplest example always is like, if you can only really understand the sentence as it accumulates meaning in time, as you speak, the thing makes sense. Before that, all you're getting is these fragments. And I think sound and listening, they're great practices because they are about that recognition of a human timescale. We are, again, technology allows us to be aspirational with that, and we can start thinking about, if you look at something like LIGO, the gravitational observatory in California, the study that they do there around gravitational waves, that's a kind of wavelength that we can't even really begin to think about. And the time attached to those waves making their way through the galaxies is so beyond comprehension. But yet technology allows us to at least detect that and quantify it so that we can maybe begin to try and qualify the experience of what that might mean. I've had a great, I'm working on a project at the moment about energy and vibration. And one of the researchers is Rana Atikari, who's working at LIGO. And he had this fantastic proposition about gravitational waves and how it is that we could maybe begin to contemplate them in a study looking at celestial art. So looking at star studies from various kinds of communities over the centuries. And he thought if you could just trace it back, because there has been such a fascination with the sky, like Aztec communities, Greeks, Egyptians, all of them had like a kind of, some of them built incredible observatories, which in Chile, there are still some of the most sophisticated celestial observatories. The remnants of those buildings are there. He started to ask, if we were to look at this mapping of the stars from all of these different places, could we see the fluxing of the universe through these gravitational waves bending time? And I thought that's such a beautiful way to think about the way that waves and frequencies and effectively how sound operates in time and space. Because I think when you were talking before about the listening into the early recordings of the phonograph, it's I imagine that people were they did accept it as a thing. I'm sure it was in the same way that we accepted the way that cassettes sounded when we first heard them. That is just how it sounded. But I think now when we return to those things, we're hearing these echoes or flutters or recurrences, and they still hold all that same experiential data, but the way that we can appreciate it becomes changed in time. And I think it's the same with this idea that Rana was talking about, this idea that it's all there, but the way that we can appreciate, the way the accumulation of the experience allows us to kind of revisit it again and again. It reveals something new each time. And I think that's kind of one of the beautiful things about working with sound and recorded sound in that way, is that when you do return to them, like I imagine when you return to working on that edition that you made for us, returning to those recordings you'd made 40 years before, I mean, you would have a direct relationship with them, but you'd also have this completely fresh perspective that was permitted, I guess, because of everything that had come in between.
Yeah, I think one thing that was interesting to me was the cumulative power of faults with the recordings. I mean, I use the word faults advisedly, but it's very much connected to what you've just been saying. That we hear, we can hear the experience, that the original experience that we had with a particular technology, but we also hear the artifacts of that technology, if you like. What I discovered listening back to certain recordings which had emotional significance to me was that the so-called faults in the recording had really become part of that emotional experience. And that to me is very interesting. How is it that a dropout in one channel or a complete failure of the machine, or some other problem with the recording process, becomes embedded in the memory, the emotional memory of that moment. And I suppose what that suggests is that all of these artifacts, all of these characteristics of every device, every process, has far more significance than we realize.
I mean, I think it's a sobering recognition that, like, each time there is a technological change, whether that be something as simple or not so simple as like bitrate resolution or whatever the case might be, there is, you recognize almost what you didn't appreciate before, or maybe as readily appreciate before. But I think you can also miss something of it, because I think as we move, like, technology has a way of trying to, it moves in a very particular line. And I think sometimes that, like, this might be a kind of nostalgic statement, but we look for those artifacts to affirm a certain kind of way that we may have listened to it at a certain stage. And I think it's interesting, the idea of fidelity as a kind of guiding principle for sound, because quite often, like from a recording studio standpoint, you're looking at these techniques that maybe alter or augment the fidelity. You don't want it to be too clear. You don't want it to be completely revealed. There's something about the mystery of the sound, how something comes to be, that holds a great, you know, sense of interest and curiosity. And that's where the magic is sometimes in music, is not knowing how things are made.
Yeah, absolutely. I was listening the other day to this new edition of yours called Viento, recordings from Antarctica and Patagonia. And I just put it on, and there's this huge visceral shock
Sorry
that
about that.
comes, but it's amazing, that comes from this first recording, which was from Patagonia, I think, right?
Mm.
So the wind and the force of the wind, and you could have made the decision, oh, I'll tone that down a bit, or I'll lead in more gradually, but it just hits you as soon as you listen. And by doing that, you actually can give some idea of what it's like to be in that extremely hostile environment.
Yeah, and I think it's not necessarily representing the direct reading of that thing. I think it's affective. For me, a field recording is a really affective medium, because it's not a didactic medium. I mean, it can be if it's accompanied by other materials, maybe, that it becomes more embedded in a sort of multifarious reading of a moment. I understand how that you can set up a situation where it becomes like a document for something. I'm not as interested in that. I mean, I appreciate that as for other people's work. I'm not as interested in it for the work that I would choose to publish, but I am very interested in the idea of how affect plays a role in that, and not knowing part is really exciting for me when I listen to someone else's recordings, and sometimes mine, not be, when I maybe return to something that I haven't listened to in a while, I hear something completely different that I wasn't focused on in that moment, and that's captured. It was captured by the microphone, even if it wasn't captured by my ears. I didn't have the interest in that moment, and I'm increasingly interested by the way that one possibility for audition influences the other. So, when I'm outside and I become fascinated with one thing, there's the kind of interior psychological listening that takes place. And I think about the microphone as a kind of exterior technological audition. And it doesn't always work in the direction that you hear something, then you want to record it. Sometimes you are listening through that prosthetic ear, and it's what reveals the point of fascination. And I like that there's this kind of feedback cycle between, you know, the things that you think that you're interested in and maybe the thing that the microphone suggests to you through its sort of agentive guiding, whether it's something as simple as the pattern of the microphone, or just, you know, it has no interest in filtering out the road, which is next to where the bird is singing in the tree, you know, and you have to kind of negotiate that thing all the time. And I think from a creative standpoint, that presents a bunch of challenges. But I also think from, if we're going back to this idea of ecology and how technology fits in that, there's also challenges there, because again, where I think from a research perspective, people are probably trying to condense down that temporality, condense down the noise factors that might mask or cloak elements that you're trying to get out. If you have a very quiet owl or something that you want to try and record, anything that's in there that's going to get in the way of that becomes a part of the experience of trying to extrapolate out the data set that you want from this enormous kind of vista of possibility.
Thinking about that, I was thinking about that with relation to, say, the relationship between field recording and music is very interesting. And that's something that you and I have, I mean, we collaborated very recently. You sent me a lot of files, actually a year ago, before I did anything about them. I had to get COVID to actually start working on them.
Thank you, COVID.
Yes. But you sent me a lot of files, which essentially they were all field recordings, I think. You know, there was shortwave in there, and there were experiments with textures of sound on surfaces, and there were what we might call conventional field recordings. In other words, sites where you're hearing birds or frogs or whatever. But you know, thinking about how to make those into music, or what we call music, is introduces a very challenging threshold judgment, I think. You know, the question of what music is, the question of what field recording is, how do they work together? And how do they fit together, and how do they make something that's a hybrid, in a sense? So I wonder, you as a musician, how much you hear the things you record as a field recordist. How much do you hear those in musical terms?
Actually, that's a good question, and one I haven't really thought about. I mean, I've thought about there's two answers to that. One is, there's one record I made that was very much about the direct relationship and that blurriness that can exist between music and field recording. I made a record called Kirina Otto, which is like the sound of fog, basically. And it came out of an experience I had. I'm pretty sure it was going to Unsound in maybe 2007. I caught the train from Berlin. And I don't know how it's possible, but Polish rail feels like it's slowing down all the time. So you're actually rolling out of the bed. So I didn't sleep very much on the overnight train. And I remember waking up or being awake very early. And I think we were coming into Katowice, maybe. I'm not sure, but I think it was Katowice. And the sun hadn't risen yet. I remember looking out the window, and it had snowed. And for us, that's incredibly exotic, just to put it on the line. Snow is not something that is really written into the Australian psyche. So I was looking out, and it had become this beautiful kind of duotone of black and white. And there was this incredible moment of going past, and there was a giant stag on a sort of hillock, just standing there proud. I'm sure I have now illustrated it with like, steam coming out of its nose and bellowing into the sky. It was a real moment. And then we came to Katowice, and there was this incredible dense fog. I don't know if it's fog or smog or pollution, whatever it was, but it was something. And it was so strong that you couldn't see the sun. The sun was rising, and you could just see this like diffused light. And I remember this great moment of looking out of the window, and there was a church spire that was across from the station, and the sun was up behind it. And I remember that if you tried to focus in on the spire, you couldn't see it because it was just all, it became diminished and lost. But if you were to like let your eyes become relaxed and just kind of go into a macro view, you'd see it kind of come out of the fog. And I thought that's a really interesting idea. Like, how would you transpose? How would you make an auditory transcription of the visual effect of fog? And that became the premise of this record, Curinato. And the way that I explored that was this very direct relationship between instrumental sounds and field recordings. It's probably the one record where they are really married together. And there are parts where I've recorded ocean or whatever the case might be, and they become musical elements. Like if you hear them, you think, oh, that's an organ or that's a keyboard, whatever. But it's the ocean. And then the inverse, you know, that you hear this kind of like what might be a white noise generator on a keyboard that becomes like a wave, you know, and that we have certain kinds of timbral relationships that we are just drawn to, and instantly we think about that. I mean, strangely, I'm working on a new record at the moment. Actually, in the beginning, I'm using this because it's sort of based around some 80s work, and I always loved that in certain kinds of films in the 80s, the white noise was the best wind generator you could have. That kind of modulated white noise would always give this like, oh wow, it's very, that desert's real windy, you know, and you'd always have that moment, and you knew it was a keyboard, but at the same time you knew it was wind, you know, and this kind of beautiful relationship and reveal. So that record was the one for me that really married that concept, or at least interrogated that concept very directly. And it was a very interesting project in that it did really make me think, you know, not just what is the relationship between something like a field recording and music, but is that a relationship that I can adequately exploit? After that record, I didn't actually work with field recordings and music together a great deal. I really segregated them because what I didn't find that enjoyable is when I would hear field recordings in a work that were just there as a kind of incidental color, you know, the sort of ambient field recording that was just there to kind of occupy space, I found not so interesting. And I think as well around that time, there was a proliferation of work that was in that area that for me didn't invite you in. And I think that's a big part of, you know, the danger sometimes with technology is that it can command you rather than you commanding it. It makes you operate in a certain way that presents challenges, particularly creatively, because there is a sort of seductive quality to technology that I think we've all succumbed to from time to time, and that's perfectly okay. We're all weak, but you know, there is an art to knowing how to reduce or reject that seduction, and to make it become a tool for you to be able to capture or express or interrogate something that maybe you would not be able to in another way. That's the relationship I find most fascinating when I'm thinking about technology and field recording.
Yeah, I think um, there's an assumption that technology will allow us to gradually unveil every mystery, but sometimes it's about ideas.
Yes.
It's interesting you talk about fog. I've read two novels about fog recently. One by Henry Green called Party Going, and one by Marjorie Allingham called The Tiger and the Smoke. And they're partly connected with my own interest in fog and a recording I've been using a lot recently of a conversation I had with my grandfather and uncle in the 1970s talking about London smog. And as you probably know, fog has strange and unpredictable effects on sound. But the two books I read, obviously they both treated fog as a kind of atmosphere, but then they treated it as a backdrop for the kind of events that can go on in a very thick fog, which might include repairing to a hotel and, sitting around and drinking, or it might include murders and so on,
Yes.
But the fog itself, although it's a strong character in both novels, it's not really described, and certainly not described as an auditory phenomenon. And this links up to you talking about snow, that there are still, to me, certain very strong, profound, you might say, sensations that we have in that kind of drastic environmental change that are still really difficult to record by audio. So snow, we all know that snow completely changes the acoustic, and that changes us emotionally. It triggers, I think it triggers memories, maybe not for you, but from Queensland, but it triggers strong memories.
I just think of Poland.
Yeah, that's right. But you wouldn't turn to an audio recording device as your first thing to record the effect of snow or fog, would you? But to me, it suggests that there's still some way to go before we can record that kind of complete change of the acoustic of an environment.
I mean, I think that's where it becomes a compositional question at this point. Still, you have to find ways to, I guess, going back to the idea of affect, to affectively suggest that shift. I mean, I think they're interesting ones because of their absence. They're environments that are sort of about a reduction or a lack of availability. But at the other end of it, I think it's actually really difficult to encounter or to effectively render the experience of listening to waves. Like if you ever go to the ocean and you sit and you listen to waves, there is so much complexity there. And I always find it fascinating, that it's so commonly described as white noise, and I think that has to do with, I think it's apt in some ways because it does feel like it goes in all directions all at once, like this. I love the theoretical idea of white noise that just kind of extends ad infinitum as this sort of impossible experience. And people describe waves in the same way because I think it is so complex, the amount of material that's happening moment to moment, that you can't actually properly appreciate it. And you almost have to give over to failure to really be able to start to let the waves come over you, so to speak. And I think when you make recordings of waves, and I had the great fortune to make a piece earlier this year that was looking at this idea of like basically wave recordings from the Pacific. It was interesting to go back to those recordings because they were maybe decades worth of recordings that I'd from different places like Japan and New Zealand, all Pacific locations. And I could hear myself trying to reach into the things that I was interested in those places and trying to capture what it was that had given myself over to in the waves. And only one or two of them, I think, are close to replicating that sensation. And I think I'm very content with my failures, I have to say, from a field recording standpoint, because there's something about that still holds that aspirational thing I spoke about very early on. I sense the aspiration in the recordings, and that's just for me. For other people, maybe they do capture that sense of like, oh, that's definitely the ocean, and you can kind of whatever, appreciate that. Or that's a violent ocean, or that's a calm ocean, or that's an ocean that has a very shallow sandbank and you can hear the thumping thunder of the wave hitting the sand as it comes down. You know, you get a sort of sensory reveal. But it's, and ironically, that recording is the one that I feel it most captures my sense of being there. This one recording I made on Bribey Island here, and I find it's one of those environments that I guess is the antithetical, I suppose, to the idea of the fog or the snow, but still shares that same sense of intensity. And it's an intense desire to try and understand it, to try and appreciate it, to try and be with it in those moments that I think you're there.
Yeah,
I
it's
find that interesting.
a lot of people seem to be obsessed with this idea is that if they get the right equipment, then they'll be able to make great field recordings. And they can't even start until they get the right equipment. But what you're talking about, I mean, at some points you're sounding almost mystical, but I know that you're not. I know that you're not mystical. What is going on in that process of understanding or being able to conceptualize a particular phenomenon, and from that point being able to develop, I guess, the nature of the recordings that you're making just by listening harder and thinking harder and really hearing what's going on. I mean, a lot of people think a microphone is a neutral device. I guess in a way we've already talked about this, but you could go with the same kit just in the way, same way that a photographer can go with the same camera to the same scene, completely different pictures.
Yes. I mean, that for me is where that idea of the kind of creativity, that sort of spurring moment of creativity, comes from the listening. That it's your preoccupations and fascinations in that moment that becomes the kernel of how a field recording can be thought of in the canon of sound arts. And it is, I've done quite a number of workshops with people over the years, and we will all be in the same place. And even when I went to the Amazon in 2008, the end of 2008, it was with a group of other field recorders. We all went there together. And I know from hearing other people's work, it took me the better part of a decade and a bit to actually know how to approach all of this material that I'd recorded. I had something like 56 hours worth of recordings. And for me, they were all very meaningful. Like, they held very strong. I still think, and I can vividly recall the experiences of being in the jungle, as I'm sure you can from, decades before me. But I didn't know what to do with the recordings because I didn't know how to make them become something that could actually hold meaning for someone else. And that translation device, or translation process, in that case was very compositional. It became this kind of condensation of experience, which was interesting that it took me so long to suddenly shrink everything down. I had to wait 10 or 15 years to kind of really be, or at least 12 years, to really be able to comprehend how someone else could make sense of all of this stuff. And also because those recordings are so dense. And I think that was one thing I was thinking about with this question of, like, going back to around the questions of ecology. There is still great failings in the technology. And, something like the Amazon is a great example of that, because if you set up a microphone there, the sheer output of sound over such a wide band of sound is so intense within, a meter or 2 meters of the microphone, that instantly other things just can't cut through, because the noise floor, for want of a better word, is just too much. There's no capacity for sort of dynamic events to be heard in any meaningful way. So I think this is something I'm kind of interested in. And I think that's probably where questions of AI listening come into, research in the future, is how it is we can train the microphone to sort of auto extract. And you see, I think already, like in some of the kind of plugins that we use for things like mastering or whatever, they're looking for kind of dynamic events in advance of you actually being able to kind of hear them. Those things are already kind of working in that way, but I think we're yet to really, because it's such a fresh area, this idea of using sound to gather data, we're yet to really see it kind of bloom into something interesting, I think.
Yeah,
And the technology isn't allowing that to bloom just yet.
well, in a way, the collaborative approach, shared hearing, you might say, is an example of how we can fill that gap, as it were. You remember when I made the record of my Yanomami recordings from southern Venezuela for Sub Rosa, and I made a 2 CD set, and then they said to me, vinyl's getting really important and popular, you need to put a vinyl record together. And I said, I can't do it, I don't know how to do it. And then I posed the question to you, I think, how would you do it? And you took what I sent you and you remixed it into something that would fit on a vinyl LP. Now, for one thing, I had to trust you to do that, and I had to let go of my own recordings. But it was incredibly interesting the way that you reformulated the whole thing into a different kind of experience in which my recordings were intact. So maybe in a sense you're taking the role of AI there. You're taking the role of the kind of smart microphone that we can record what we want it to. But I think that reimagining of the material was quite incredible to me, and I've done that on a number of occasions, or one or two occasions since then with you, because I know I trust you to do that, and you'll do it with a sympathetic ear, but you'll actually, you won't be so timid that you'll preserve my perspective of the recording. You'll really take it on as something that you need to reimagine.
Well, in some respects, I can't have your sense of it, which I think is an interesting position to start from. That some things are not permitted, or not possible, and I think that deficiency is actually a great place to start from, in some respects, because I have to obviously, partly I'm sure it's personal aesthetics comes into that experience, but it's also, and now that I think about it, maybe that partly informed how I came to think about my own Amazon pieces. How do I condense down what would have been an incredibly dense period of experiencing sound, and how can you, I think the thing I wanted to try and capture was that sense of intensity, that there were these rituals and events that you were privy to, for a period of time, and for a very dense period of time, and even when they weren't taking place, the kind of resonance of them still was there, like that recording of I guess it's nighttime. Is there a potu in that recording?
No, there's no potu. Unfortunately, I did hear potus, but I didn't get to record them, unfortunately.
I do love a potu.
I know, amazing. Incredible birds.
Everyone can go and look up potus after we're done. Just jump onto YouTube, you'll be set.
Yeah, but you know what? You listen to those YouTube clips and none of them...
They're not great, are they?
None of them capture
They are terrible.
How strange and eerie the sound of a group of Potus actually is. But anyway, that's another
well,
subject.
I think part of that though reveals the nature of the way that those recordings are made. They are made very directly, and they're trying to do that objective rendering of the bird, when actually the experience is hearing them coming through, weirdly reflected off all of the trees in the jungle, with
And
all of this other material around them.
I heard them coming across the sound coming across the river as well.
Oh, even better.
You know, it's even more magical.
Mm.
But you know, if I tried to record that at that time, it would have been nothing. You know, I would have been like, I don't know, half a mile away or something.
Yeah. And look, the thing is, some recordings aren't meant to be. Like the fish that got away is such a huge part of this practice. Some things are just for us. And actually, some things that are recorded are just for us also. This idea of being able to share everything, I think I feel is unnecessary. I don't need to know everything. I don't want to know everything.
Maybe it's also unethical.
Yeah, and I think that is a big question, actually. Increasingly, there's that great book, in fact, I have it right nearby, Hungry Listening, which is this, text around beginning to consider the indigenous voice in listening, and listening as a kind of colonial, like contemporary writing around listening through that sort of post-colonial lens. Incredibly important, because there is, I mean, we've spoken about various kinds of listening, but when you begin to expand out from that, the kind of listening that we're talking about, that sort of aesthetic or scientifically informed audition, and you begin to consider questions of indigeneity, like the Australian Indigenous folks have such an incredible way of approaching sound. Obviously, there's that conversation around deep listening, but a very dear friend of mine, Carl Slab, who's a Bundjalung guy, lives about 2 hours south of here. He and I have spent a lot of time talking about listening, because we both realized that, I mean, we were sitting down talking once, and he drew me a picture. I think I was actually drawing him a picture of my relational listening theory. I have these, two overarching horizons of audition. And he said, well, that's interesting because we use circles a lot. And he drew this diagram of his understanding of binungal, is the word that the Bundjalung have, which is a kind of listening, but it's listening that happens in degrees. And I'm not explaining, it's his concept to explain, but the way he described it to me, I recognized so much the different ways that we inherently approach that experience of trying to engage, trying to be present, and the kinds of dimensions to audition that exist, that we may or may not be privileged to. And I think that in all kinds of listening, that's part of the deal. I think we assume that listening is a kind of right, but I actually think it's not. It's something that's earned. I often talk about it in terms of weightlifting. You don't start by lifting 300 pounds. You start with some dumbbells, and then maybe you do a deadlift, and then before you know it, you've managed to get up. Listening's the same kind of thing. It's fatiguing, and it's not something we do all the time. We don't listen more than we listen, because it's even someone. I mean, hopefully everyone is charmed by our dulcet tones now, but if you've been listening to this for an hour, it's a lot to take in. Even something as simple as like words. When you're out in the field and in a very dense environment, it can be overwhelming very quickly. And I think that's not something to be taken lightly, maybe, when we think about that idea.
Yeah. Well, we always have to remember that recording is a form of surveillance.
Yes.
And I've just been writing a piece actually about partly about eavesdropping and overhearing in Jane Austen's novels. And overhearing is a really interesting word.
I love that word,
because it's about an excess of hearing at the same time as it's about eavesdropping. and an excess of hearing is it relates to this question of noise, of course, but it also relates to the idea of spying, using listening through listening technology as a kind of spying. So, if we're talking about ecologies, then that's something I think that has to be uppermost in our mind when we're recording. That in a sense we're spying on different communities.
Definitely.
So
It's
there's always
actually
an
interesting,
ethical dimension.
which I think we're only just becoming aware of, to be fair. I think that's only been a point of conversation in the last probably decade, which is a shame that it hasn't kind of arisen sooner. And it should have. I mean, I think we recognized in the 1970s, when there was a lot of that fallout from ethnographic research, that that ethics played a huge role in the way that we do it. I don't think people necessarily made a direct linkage to sound, but I think increasingly there is a consciousness around that, which I think will only become more embedded. Well, hopefully will become more embedded as we move forward. But yeah, it is interesting, that question of, or that term overhearing, because it's almost, I wonder if you could mount an argument that the overhearing, the excess, is actually where it like the flipping into listening. That, like, because when you're spying, when you're surveilling, you are in that kind of deep sense of listening. You're trying to extract out as much detail from something that might be minuscule or just not quite available. And hearing feels, at least to me, that kind of very passive, ongoing state that we're not necessarily so attuned to, but the overhearing somehow suggests this spilling over into the direct sensing, or direct kind of wanting to be in the moment.
Yeah, my experience of this, which I've talked about with you before, was in Amazonas,
Mm.
and there was a ceremony of literally consuming the ancestors. This was with a Yanomami group, and they grind some of the bone matter of ancestors into powder and mix it with a kind of drink. And I was allowed to attend that ceremony, but I was told I couldn't record it. And the sound of it was one of the most remarkable things I've ever heard. It was everybody in the shelter was crying. So there was just a sound of weeping. And it was a sort of soft weeping. It wasn't wailing. And obviously I mean, not at that time because I had a big tape recorder, but now, obviously, you could go into that situation with a little tape recorder or even with your phone and record that. But that to me would have been a prime example of overhearing. That, yes, in a way, the sound of it is taking you into a real deep listening area. Where you're very present in the scene, and it's emotionally quite overwhelming. But it's also overhearing in the sense that you're hearing too much. And it's okay, because when you go away, the sound doesn't come with you. You're leaving it behind where it belongs. But if you take away a recording of it, then that's a completely different thing and is actually very suspect.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting sense, because I think somehow that experience probably has embedded itself much more inside you because of you returning to it in memory than it would have if you'd made the recording. There's I think there's such an intensity of trying to be there and be available to that sound in that moment, that if you're there with, sometimes I think with something like field recording or any kind of recording device, I think you can be, it's like people go to concerts and you just look at people looking through their phones as they film it on their phones. It's this kind of like one step removed thing. And I think it's very easy for that to take place now, with particularly because in some respects of the fidelity that's available to us technologically.
Yeah.
And that's where the seduction question comes into it again. You know, that
Yeah.
it's very easy to just do that. And I think probably had they said to you, you know, go ahead and record this, it might not hold the same place in your life that it does now. And
For sure.
actually,
Yeah.
yeah, the sound also, you know, each time you return to it, it might not give you that same, it may not have the same intensity, whereas the memory, I'm sure, holds the intensity because it's embedded, it's embodied.
Yeah. I should say for anybody who's listening and watching, if you have a question, you have
Yes, now
less
is the
than
time for
15
questions.
minutes. Now is the
Yeah.
time. So
Yes.
put them in the chat if you have anything you want to ask Lawrence.
Or David, for
Um,
that matter.
or, or me. Yes, yes,
Yes.
yes, yes. So
Okay,
there's a question here. Great.
we have a question.
So questions from Tanvi Ranjan. Recordings capture a passive listening, and at times those passive sounds could be more interesting when revisited. What does it speak about our attentiveness at the time of recording? That's a good question. What do you think about attentiveness when you're recording?
Yeah. Well, I might have said just before, you know, sometimes when you go back to those recordings, something is revealed that you just weren't focused on in the moment when you were there, you know. And I think sometimes you actively fight against that as well. I've certainly found myself doing that, particularly, I would say less so now. I'm much more comfortable with letting things unfold than trying to chase something or to try and stop something that's happening. And I can give a very um, recent example. It's actually a recording that I've sent to you, which was of this the Australian potu, the tawny frogmouth, which you can all go and look at afterwards as well. I went to this location, Nugum Red White Rock, which is about 40 minutes west of where I live, and it's got a very interesting history. I mean, it's a sacred site. The rock itself is a sacred site for Indigenous women, and it actually exists today as a park because it was used during the Second World War as a munitions testing site for soldiers, American soldiers, and they couldn't turn it into land like housing because there are unexploded munitions there. So it's been saved by this very sort of perverse situation. But the rock it's incredibly powerful place. It really is a genuinely powerful place. And at the base of the rock, when I was there, ironically, it's been raining all the time here, but it had rained and it had formed a sort of seasonal billabong at the bottom of the rock. And I'd set up to make this recording of the swamp because literally within a couple of meters, it became this microcosm of activity. All of these insects and marsh frogs popping and reflecting off the rock. And I set up this recording and I thought it was coming into dusk at this point. I thought I'm just going to let this run for a little while. And I set up and I was listening and I thought I'm just going to go and sit down because I just want to listen to this. I don't, the recording's going to do what it's going to do. I want to sit down and listen to it. And I was sitting there listening and it was amazing because these drum cicadas were calling and it was dark and they usually don't call at night. So there's distant sizzling in the air of these incredibly high pitched cicadas. And then maybe 50 meters away from me, I could just hear this like pulsing sound, this doot, 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 which is the tawny frogmouth. And I have never been able to record a tawny frogmouth. Many times I've tried, but there is always, they either fly off or there's background noise. We get them in the yard here where I live. but you just can't record them because they're a low frequency sound. It needs a very particular environment. And I thought, oh, maybe I should just pack up here and go and get, try and record this tawny frogmouth. And I thought, actually, this is just for me, this moment. So I sat there and I was maybe sitting there for 30 minutes, letting this recording go. And I could hear that tawny frogmouth was in this one spot. And it's just pulsing away. And I thought, wow, I really should have recorded that because it's been there the whole time. And anyway, I thought, well, that's been a beautiful experience. I'm going to go back and get the gear. So I picked it up. And as I picked up the microphone, I had the recorder, I turned around and I saw the tawny frogmouth fly into this tree directly in front of me. I thought, bloody hell. And I just put the microphone down. I didn't have my headphones on. It was partially packed up. And I just twisted it round and I pressed record. And I remember standing there thinking like, well, I don't know what's going on. I could see there was sound coming into the microphone. And then it just started pulsing, this like do it right in front of the microphone. And it was this complete happenstance moment, but absolutely kind of fascinating thing. But going back to the recording and the other recordings I'd made that day, I had been focused on certain things. There was a lot of cicadas, so they had kind of dominated my perception of that place because they're so loud. You almost can't, psychologically, you can't sort of believe anything else can cut through them, But I'd go back and listen to the recordings, and all of them in the first section had traffic in them. Even though the highway was many, many kilometers away, it was as if all I could consume was the cicadas, or I was allowed to consume was the cicadas. But going back, I found these moments just in terms of this idea of sort of, I don't know if it's passive listening, maybe it's directed listening, or over attentiveness. That could be part of what we're explaining here. I had been overly attentive to these cicadas, and I didn't realize all of this other material was going on. But going back to the recording, there are these incredible phase relationships almost, when it's as if the microphone can't capture everything. It's trying to suck it all in, but you're getting these weird inflections of like low frequency pulsing versus this high frequency beating of the cicadas. And it was one of those recordings where I came back to it and thought, wow, I thought I was focused there, but clearly I wasn't. Or maybe I was, as I say, differently focused. But it was incredible. It really, you can't always be sure what you're getting. And that's part of the exchange that you have to just be available to.
And I love that recording. I mean, I've listened to it a lot. And to me, it's like a Chinese watercolor painting or something. It's got a kind of haziness about it and a perspective. Whereas, if you'd been chasing about and, trying to sharpen it up in some way or another, then it would have had a completely different effect. But it has an incredible depth. It's so beautiful. There's another question here from Rowan Affleck. Do you have any thoughts about if or how waves, vibrations, or frequencies might inform structural properties of landscapes?
That's a good question. Definitely. There's no doubt about that. I mean, if you look at very recently for us anyway, the Kingdom of Tonga being completely transformed by an enormous pressure wave of the volcano that erupted there. There are those very direct kinds of engagements that the materiality of the earth is absolutely shaped by vibration. I had a quite interesting experience. We are building a series of cross-river rail tunnels at the moment in Brisbane. And I had the opportunity to go into the tunnels and while they're constructing them. And very close to where I live, there's one of the exit points of these enormous, like the 100-meter long diggers, the things that if anyone has watched the Arnold Schwarzenegger Total Recall, that's what I picture those sort of things drilling through the ground looking like. And they kind of look like that, these enormous plates that basically excavate a tunnel big enough to fit the train in them. And I was able to go and record the like vibration of the digger as it was coming up towards where it was going to exit out. And you could feel it. You could see it actually beginning to, like, the vibration was physically altering the soil where it was nearby. And when you put, I have this beautiful geophone that as I put it in, there was just this enormous rush of low frequency energy. That was this, the sound of the earth being torn apart by this enormous sort of machine. So I think we are increasingly aware of those relationships around vibration and wave and frequency. I mean, we haven't really had a chance to talk about it, but there's some of the studies around plant audition, for example. Monica Gagliano, who's in Perth, has done these incredible plant audition research projects around basically young saplings that will be drawn or that listen for the sound of water. And they've sort of done this blind testing, and they will grow towards the sound of the water, even if it's not, there's no actual water there. They will grow towards the sound of it. And they've been able to tune it so they can see the frequency bandwidths that those plants are actually attuned to. And, I think very early on, we were talking about those elephants. Again, plants are another example of that. Michael Prime's recordings, reveal this whole other bioacoustic energy that is out there. All of these frequencies that sit just there, right in front of us, but we can't tangibly hold them unless we have that kind of technological interface.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think there's definitely very direct relations between that idea of frequency and vibration and landscape.
We've got less than 4 minutes left. Can you answer this question from Sebastian Concha? Have you ever experienced remote recording? How do you feel about the possibility of constant hearing a given landscape? Maybe that means constantly hearing
a given landscape.
landscape.
So you mean like, yeah, okay. Actually, yes, but I will admit this is totally to do with peregrine falcons. I have
Your obsession.
Yes, I have. There was a period there where in Victoria there was a pair of peregrines that were raising chicks on the side of a building that had a microphone in the feed. Yes, I did. I did experience that recording. Look, I think it's an interesting proposition. It's completely bewildering in a way to engage in it, because it's so abstracted from where you are. You're sitting in your office or studio or whatever, and here you are trying to, like, you can I will admit the peregrine one was great because they're so high up. You just mostly hear wind buffeting the building, and you hear sirens, and occasionally you hear the peregrines calling to each other. And I love that idea of the strata of sound. If I get on my roof, which is above the tree line here, because we have quite a tall house, if I'm on the top of the roof, it is like there is a whole other world that exists for the swallows and from some other birds that maybe fly by, and planes. I don't have any access to that. And I just think strangely, even if, like, visually, when you start to look down or you look up, you just realize there are these whole other places that we tune out. And I love being on the roof with that, getting that sense of dimension, the greater dimension than being in a yard. The yard has a fence and there's trees and kind of feels closed in, but you get up on the roof and suddenly there's this vista that just goes out in all directions, and these little sound markers of the swallows kind of moving around, just tracing out their own lines. It's extraordinary. I see we've got another question as well, so I should probably.
But the important, I mean, we're on our last minute, so I don't think another question is possible. But I just wanted to say that what you seem to be talking about here is sound recording as a way for us to re-examine, if you like, our own potential. Yes. To understand more about the possibilities of being human. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, it's a promise. It's that aspirational promise. And I think that is the true value going forward in deepening this practice for sure. And it also, it's like science, you know, we only know what we can, like, it's always the best working theory we have. And it's the same, the relationship between technology and audition, it's the same thing. It's the best working relationship we can strike at that time. And each time something is revealed, we realize actually there's something else beyond that. It's this kind of constant process. There's another layer and another layer and another layer. And the great opportunity is for all of us as practitioners or interested parties is to participate in that reveal, you know, and you never know when it's going to come. And you never know where it's going to come from. And I think that's what keeps it exciting, and what keeps you coming back to that, like the promise that listening is.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you very much
Thank
for
you, David.
speaking so eloquently and giving up your time. And thank you for everybody who's been with us. Sorry to Tom Costello, we didn't get around to your question. And I should just say, to wind up, that next week's talk will be about computational models of living systems, with Marshmallow Laser Feast VR designers and 2 scientists working using AI and evolutionary algorithms to understand living systems. Thank you very much. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Bye.